For decades, he lived alone in the forest, underground. No one knew what was hidden inside his cabin until an inspector went in. What she saw there is better left untold. Subscribe to the channel and comment below where you're watching this video from. The first snow had fallen early that year in northern Montana, covering the pine forests in a white hush that seemed almost sacred. The mountains loomed behind the clouds, their shapes blurred by the drifting mist. Wind moved through the valleys like something alive, brushing against the trees and whispering through the branches. Out here, away from the paved roads and glowing towns, silence wasn't the absence of sound. It was its own kind of voice. On most maps, this region was marked only by a faint gray patch labeled restricted wilderness. Yet one cold morning, a single line of data appeared on a monitor inside the Forest Service office in Kalispell. A heat signature in the middle of nowhere. It was faint but constant, something alive, producing warmth. There were no registered cabins or campsites in that quadrant, no official logging permits, no homesteads, just frozen soil, wolves, and endless trees. The system flagged it automatically as an anomaly, but to the human eye it looked like a steady pulse, deep in the woods, repeating every night for weeks. At first, no one cared. Sometimes hunters set up illegal fires. Sometimes survey drones malfunctioned. But the signal kept returning in the same exact coordinates, through storms and blackout nights. That persistence drew attention. When the notice reached Field Inspector Emily Carter, she read it without surprise. Strange reports from the northern forests were common lights in the sky, voices over the wind, a shadowed cabin seen from a ridge. Most were tricks of nature. Yet something about this entry felt different. The regularity of the signal, the pattern of its heat fluctuations, it wasn't random. It looked engineered. She leaned back in her chair, the hum of the fluorescent light above her filling the small office. On her desk lay a stack of forms, half-completed reports, and a cold cup of coffee that smelled of wood smoke. Outside the window, snow kept falling in silent waves. Her supervisor, a weary man named Daly, noticed her staring at the map. "You thinking of going out there?" he asked. Emily nodded slowly. "Just to take a look. It's probably nothing." Daly frowned. "That patch isn't easy country. No roads within 20 miles. Last winter, a rescue team lost 2 snowmobiles up that way." Emily's eyes never left the screen. "If someone's living there without registration, they'll need a check. That's policy." Daly sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Fine, but take the satellite beacon. The storm front's moving in fast. You lose signal out there, we might not find you till spring." That night, Emily went home to pack. Her small cabin near the Flathead River smelled of pine sap and diesel from the heater. She moved with quiet precision, laying out her gear the way she'd learned years ago in the reserves. A canvas pack, thermal rations, spare gloves, a field radio, a camera, her knife, and the old sidearm she hoped she wouldn't need. The silence of the room pressed around her like the forest itself. She wasn't afraid. She hadn't been afraid of the wilderness for years, but a familiar unease crept in as she zipped the pack shut. There was always something about these forgotten places where human maps ended and nature began reclaiming its dominion. It was as if the land remembered what people had chosen to forget. She left before dawn. Her truck's headlights cut through the snow like blades, illuminating only the narrow ribbon of road ahead. By sunrise, she had reached the last ranger station. Beyond that, there were no more paved roads, only frozen logging trails and the slow ascent of the hills. She parked near the gate, locked the vehicle, and switched to snowshoes. The temperature hovered near zero, and the wind carried the sharp scent of pine resin. Her radio crackled once, then fell silent. She walked. Hours passed. The forest deepened. The world became nothing but white and green, and the crunch of her steps. Deer tracks crossed her path, vanishing into thickets. At one point, she stopped by a creek half buried in ice. The water beneath the glassy surface still moved slowly, deliberately. She took a sip from her thermos and looked at the sky. It was already turning gray again. The storm Daly had warned her about was coming faster than expected. Still, she pressed on. Somewhere ahead, beyond the second ridge, was the source of that heat signature. By midday, snow began to fall harder. Each flake felt heavier, as if the forest were trying to push her back. Emily pulled her hood tighter, scanning the slope. Her compass wavered briefly, then steadied. She frowned. That was the second time the needle had flickered. Maybe it was just magnetic interference from the iron in the rocks, or maybe something else. The forest was old here, older than any recorded trail. Even the pines grew differently, their trunks twisted, their bark dark as coal. She walked until the trees thinned enough to reveal a clearing, small and uneven, where the snow gathered in rippling drifts. At first she saw nothing unusual, but then, on the far edge, near a line of fallen birches, a thin spiral of smoke rose into the gray air. It wasn't the bright, acrid smoke of a campfire. It was pale, almost translucent, more like steam. She crouched, watching. It came not from a chimney, but from the ground itself. Emily's heart quickened. She switched her thermal scanner on and aimed it toward the source. The display glowed orange-red. The heat was steady, too steady for a natural vent. Someone or something was maintaining it. She moved closer, every step sinking into the soft snow. Her breath fogged in front of her face. When she reached the birches, she saw what looked like a mound in the earth, half covered by moss and snow. At first glance, it might have been just another hillock, except for the fact that a wooden frame jutted from one side. It was a door. The door was made of rough-hewn planks, weathered and green with age. Its hinges were rusted, yet recently oiled. Around it, the snow was tamped down by boots. She knelt and brushed aside the frost from the handle. Warmth radiated faintly from the crack between the boards. Someone was definitely inside. She hesitated. Procedure said she should announce herself, call for backup, log her coordinates. But the radio was dead, and the storm clouds were thickening. She could wait, or she could find out what was happening now, while daylight still lingered. Emily took a deep breath, pulled off her glove, and knocked. At first there was no sound, only the sigh of the wind through the trees. Then came a faint creak, followed by a single metallic clang from within. She stepped back, her hand instinctively going to her belt. The door moved a fraction, enough for a sliver of light to escape a warm amber glow that cut through the white air. A man's voice, low and rough, came from the shadow. "You shouldn't be here." Emily steadied her breath. "I'm with the Forest Service," she said clearly. "We registered a heat source. I just need to verify." The door opened wider. The man who stood there looked like he'd stepped out of another century. His beard was long and streaked with gray, his clothes heavy canvas patched with leather. His eyes, pale and alert, studied her without fear. "The forest doesn't need verification," he said softly. "It takes care of itself." She didn't move. Behind him she could see a faint glow, the flicker of a fire, and the vague outline of shelves carved directly into the wall. The air that escaped from the doorway carried a mix of pine smoke, resin, and something else metal, maybe oil. It was not the smell of decay, but of machinery long in use. The man's gaze dropped briefly to her badge, then rose again. "You came alone?" Emily nodded. He didn't seem surprised. For a moment they stood in silence, two strangers surrounded by the endless whiteness. Then he turned and stepped aside, gesturing toward the doorway. "The storm's coming. You can wait inside." She hesitated, glancing once at the horizon where the clouds thickened into dark bands. Then she stepped over the threshold. Inside, the temperature rose immediately. The small space was dim, lit by an oil lamp hanging from a beam. The walls were built from packed earth reinforced by wooden planks. A simple stove hummed quietly in the corner. On a nearby table lay a collection of tools, wrenches, copper wire, a compass, and what looked like a handmade electrical coil. Everything was meticulously arranged, almost surgically clean. The man closed the door behind them and fastened a heavy latch. "Storm will hit in an hour," he said. "You won't get far in that." Emily removed her gloves and brushed snow from her coat. "Do you live here year-round?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked to the stove, adjusted a valve, and added a piece of wood. "Been here long enough," he said finally. "Longer than most people stay anywhere." His voice carried no arrogance, only certainty. She studied him more closely. His hands were scarred, the kind that had known both tools and weapons. There was something military in his movements, the precise way he placed each object, the quiet control of his posture. He caught her gaze and smiled faintly. "Name's Thomas," he said. "You can sit if you want." Emily took the offer, lowering herself onto a wooden chair near the wall. The warmth from the stove seeped into her boots. She looked around, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The interior seemed larger than it should have been. One wall held shelves filled with small, carved figures, birds, deer, trees. Another had old books stacked neatly beside rolled maps. Everything in the room spoke of years of deliberate solitude, of a man who had built a world by hand. Outside, the wind began to howl. The door shuddered under its weight, but the structure held firm. Emily sipped from her thermos and kept her voice even. "Satellite picked up your heat signal. You're off-grid, which violates the permit code for this region. You're lucky it was me and not enforcement." Thomas didn't react. He stared into the fire. "There are worse things than being off-grid," he murmured. She frowned. "What are you doing out here?" He looked at her, and for a heartbeat his eyes seemed to reflect the flicker of the lamp. "Building something that lasts." The words hung in the air. The storm outside grew louder, snow striking the roof in steady waves. Emily felt an odd vibration through the floorboards, a hum so faint she thought at first it was the wind. But it wasn't. It was coming from beneath them. She opened her mouth to ask, but Thomas's expression stopped her. He looked almost serene, as though listening to a rhythm only he could hear. Then he said quietly, "The forest has a heartbeat. You'll feel it soon enough." Emily sat back, uneasy. The sound was subtle but constant, pulsing like breath under the ground. The warmth in the room felt unnatural now, steady and mechanical. She thought again of the thermal images, of the perfect regularity of that heat. Outside, the storm hit in full force. The door rattled once, twice, then went still. Inside, only the soft hum remained, and the two of them sitting in the amber glow, strangers bound by the same silence. When Emily finally looked toward the corner where the floor met the wall, she noticed a faint seam in the planks, a narrow outline, rectangular, like a hidden hatch. The vibration seemed strongest there. Thomas followed her gaze but said nothing. The lamp flickered, throwing shadows across the earthen walls. Snow roared against the roof, and the forest beyond vanished into darkness. Emily tightened her grip on the thermos and met his eyes. "What's down there?" she asked quietly. Thomas didn't answer. Instead, he reached for the latch on the stove, feeding it another log. The hum beneath them deepened, steady and patient. And in that instant, she understood something she couldn't yet explain, that whatever was hidden under this small cabin was the reason she'd come, even if she hadn't known it until now. The wind screamed outside and the storm swallowed the forest whole. Inside, the light dimmed to a thin gold shimmer. Thomas's voice came softly through the rising howl. "You should get some rest. Tomorrow you'll see for yourself." Emily wanted to ask again, but the warmth, the exhaustion, and the rhythmic pulse beneath the floor lulled her into silence. By the time she closed her eyes, the snow had sealed the door completely, leaving them isolated in a world that no longer had edges. The last thing she heard before sleep took her was that low, steady vibration, the sound of something alive deep beneath the earth, waiting. And when morning came, nothing in her life would ever be the same. When Emily woke the next morning, the storm had eased but not vanished. The wind outside had softened into a low moan, brushing against the cabin's earthen walls like a giant slow breath. A muted gray light filtered through the narrow window, illuminating the room in a pale haze. For a moment she forgot where she was. The warmth, the hum beneath her feet, the smell of pine smoke. It all felt like a dream that clung to her even after her eyes opened. Then she turned her head and saw Thomas sitting near the stove, sharpening a knife with deliberate, even strokes. The sight brought everything back at once. The forest, the storm, the strange hum, the hidden hatch she had glimpsed the night before. He noticed her stirring and stopped. "You sleep like a soldier," he said quietly. Didn't even flinch during the worst of it. His tone carried no mockery. It was an observation, plain and precise. Emily sat up, brushing her hair back, the blanket heavy with the scent of smoke. "I've been through worse nights," she replied. "The roof held. You built it well." He gave a faint nod, as if the compliment were unnecessary. "The oak beams came from down the ridge," he said. "Older than any of us. They remember how to stand." His words carried a kind of reverence that made her pause. There was something about the way he spoke, as though he didn't just live among the trees but belonged to them, like a creature the forest itself had shaped. Emily pulled on her boots and stood, stretching her arms. The warmth in the air was steady, not the sharp, fleeting heat of a stove, but a deeper warmth, the kind that seemed to rise from the ground itself. She felt it under her soles, gentle and rhythmic, as though the earth beneath the cabin was alive and breathing. She turned toward the corner where she'd seen the faint seam in the floor, but it was covered now by a heavy woven rug. Thomas followed her glance but said nothing, his expression unreadable. She approached the small window and peered outside. The world had changed overnight. The snow lay in smooth, unbroken waves across the clearing. The trees were draped in white, their branches bending under the weight. Not a single footprint remained from her arrival. It was as if no one had entered or left the forest in years. The sky hung low and pale, swollen with more snow. "It's beautiful," she murmured. "Beautiful," Thomas echoed softly, "and merciless." He rose, hanging the knife on a peg by the door. "You'll have to wait until afternoon to head back. The path won't hold yet. The snow's too heavy." Emily turned to him. "That's fine. I'd like to look around a bit if that's all right." He hesitated, then shrugged. "So long as you don't wander far. The woods are deeper than they look." He handed her a cup of something hot, a herbal tea, earthy and faintly bitter. She accepted it, her fingers brushing his for an instant. His skin was rough and warm, like bark warmed by sunlight. "Thank you," she said. He gave no answer, only returned to the stove, tending the fire with quiet precision. She watched him for a moment longer, then stepped to the door and unlatched it. The air outside struck her face like a blade of ice. The stillness was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. She walked a few paces into the clearing, her boots sinking softly into the snow. The cabin behind her looked smaller than she remembered, almost hidden beneath the white. Only the faint wisp of smoke from the stovepipe betrayed its existence. She circled it slowly, noting the way the structure seemed half swallowed by the earth. The walls weren't built on top of the ground, but into it, reinforced with stone and moss. The seams were seamless, like something grown rather than constructed. On the far side, she found a mound of soil covered in tangled roots. At first, she thought it was a collapsed wall, but as she brushed the snow aside, she saw a vent made of metal, old, weathered, but clearly functional. Warm air drifted from it in gentle bursts. It was the source of the faint steam she'd seen yesterday from the ridge. She crouched beside it, pressing her palm against the metal. It was warm unnaturally so, even for an exhaust vent. Something mechanical was alive beneath this cabin. "Curiosity kills quicker than cold," came Thomas's voice behind her. She turned sharply. He stood only a few steps away, silent as the snow. She hadn't even heard him approach. "You're not the first to be curious about this place," he said. "The others didn't make it far." She rose, brushing snow from her gloves. "Others?" He regarded her with calm indifference. "Trappers mostly. A surveyor once, maybe 20 years ago. The forest doesn't like strangers." Emily frowned. "The forest doesn't get to decide that." He smiled faintly. "Doesn't it?" They walked back toward the door. Inside, the warmth swallowed her again, and for a moment she felt dizzy from the sudden change. He closed the latch, brushed the snow from his coat, and sat by the stove, as if the conversation had never happened. She placed her gloves on the table to dry and looked around the cabin once more. The interior was a study in contradictions, primitive and modern at the same time. The walls were carved from the very soil, yet every tool, every joint, every corner bore the precision of an engineer. Copper wires ran discreetly along the beams, connecting to a small device near the shelf. It hummed faintly, a rhythm too steady to be accidental. "You have power out here," she said quietly. "How?" He looked up, eyes sharp. "I make what I need." "That doesn't answer my question." "Some questions don't want answers." She met his gaze. "You used to be an engineer, didn't you? Army Corps, maybe?" Something flickered behind his expression, an acknowledgement, quickly buried. A long time ago, he said. That man doesn't live here anymore. But he built this, she insisted. He's still here in every piece of it. Thomas rose slowly, his chair scraping the floor. You think you understand because you've seen a few wires and a vent. You don't know what this place is. Then tell me. He looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing something invisible between them. Then he said, If you want to know, you'll have to see it for yourself. But not today. The ground's restless. The storm woke it. His words sent a chill through her, though the room was warm. She thought of the hum beneath her boots, the faint pulse that never stopped. What kind of system could produce such constant heat, such precision? It wasn't a generator. She'd heard enough of those in her life to know the difference. This was something else, something that felt alive in a way no machine should. Thomas poured himself another cup of tea, his movements slow and methodical. You came here because your instruments told you something was wrong, he said. But they don't understand this place any better than you do. They only measure what they can see. The real work happens beneath the surface. Emily folded her arms. And what exactly are you working on beneath the surface? He didn't look up. Peace. The simplicity of the word startled her. Peace, she repeated. He smiled faintly. The kind you can build. Before she could ask more, the lamp flickered. The hum in the floor shifted, deepened. Thomas's head turned sharply, listening. For a few seconds, the entire cabin seemed to vibrate, as if something massive had moved beneath it. Then, just as suddenly, the sensation stopped. He exhaled slowly, tension fading from his shoulders. Emily stepped closer. What was that? He didn't answer. Instead, he walked to the corner and lifted the rug she'd noticed before. Beneath it lay the outline of the hatch, rectangular, metal-edged, built seamlessly into the floorboards. She crouched beside it, studying the craftsmanship. There was no visible handle, no hinge. It looked more like part of the floor than a door. Thomas knelt beside her, tracing the edge with his finger. Down there, he said softly, is what keeps this place alive. She felt her pulse quicken. Alive how? He looked at her, and for the first time she thought she saw a flicker of fear, or perhaps respect. You'll understand when it's ready to be seen. Until then, trust that it works. The way he said it made her believe it wasn't a warning, but a plea. He replaced the rug carefully, smoothing it with his hand until the floor looked whole again. The hum continued, faint but constant, as if responding to his touch. Afternoon crept toward evening. The storm began to thin, revealing streaks of pale sky between the clouds. Emily sat near the window, staring at the forest. The snow had stopped falling. In the fading light, the world outside looked untouched, no tracks, no sign of intrusion. Yet deep beneath her feet, something stirred, hidden but awake. Thomas busied himself with his tools, adjusting wires, scribbling notes in a weathered notebook. Once she caught sight of the page's diagrams, formulas, precise measurements written in neat military handwriting. None of it looked like the work of a recluse. It looked like research. You're building something, she said quietly. This isn't just survival. He didn't look up. Everything that survives builds. As the light dimmed, she grew restless. When the storm clears, I'll need to report back, she said. They'll want to know you're here. His pencil froze. And what will you tell them? She hesitated. The truth, she thought, but the words felt uncertain. That someone's living here. That you're stable, self-sufficient. Nothing more. He nodded slowly, though his eyes were distant. If you tell them where I am, they'll come. They always come. And they take until there's nothing left. Emily studied him in silence. He didn't sound paranoid. He sounded like a man who had seen it happen before. The light outside dimmed to blue. The forest turned into a silhouette against the sky. Inside, the air hummed with quiet energy, steady as a heartbeat. She realized that every part of the cabin, from the stove's low whisper to the warmth underfoot, was connected, breathing in unison. It wasn't just a home, it was a system. Thomas extinguished the lamp and sat opposite her, the fire casting shadows across his face. You should sleep again, he said. The storm will end tonight. Tomorrow you'll decide what you came here to find. She wanted to argue, to press for answers, but exhaustion weighed on her like the snow on the trees. She lay down, the hum beneath her steady and strange. Outside, the wind sighed one last time before surrendering to silence. Sometime after midnight, a sound woke her, a faint metallic click, like a latch releasing. She opened her eyes. The fire was out. The room glowed faintly from the cracks in the floor, a dim golden light pulsing upward, as though the earth itself breathed through the boards. She rose quietly, holding her breath. The glow came from the corner beneath the rug. She took one step closer. The air vibrated softly, like a deep note of music too low to hear, but strong enough to feel. Then the light faded, vanishing as suddenly as it had appeared. When morning came, the world above the cabin would look unchanged, calm, white, innocent. But Emily knew something had shifted beneath the surface. She could feel it in the floor, in the warmth of the air, in the silence that pressed around them both. Thomas was already awake, sitting by the door with his hands folded, as if he'd been waiting for her to open her eyes. He gave her a long, unreadable look and said only one thing. "Now you've heard it too." And in that single sentence, she understood that the mystery she had come to investigate had only begun to unfold. The wind returned that evening like a restless spirit, shaking the tops of the trees and whispering through the narrow chimney. By the time darkness swallowed the clearing, the storm had gathered strength once more. Snow fell in heavy spirals, and the cabin, half buried in its white cocoon, seemed to merge with the earth itself. Inside, the world felt smaller than before. The flicker of the oil lamp painted soft circles of light on the walls, and the low hum beneath the floor continued its steady rhythm, pulsing like a second heartbeat that filled the silence between them. Emily sat by the window, watching the storm build. She could see almost nothing now, just the shifting gray of snow swirling against the glass. Her reflection hovered faintly in the pane, ghost-like and pale. Behind her, Thomas moved quietly about the room, checking the stove, tightening the hinges on the door, securing what needed to hold. Every movement was methodical, practiced. He didn't waste a gesture or a word. She tried to focus on the storm outside, but her mind kept circling back to the light she had seen the night before, the faint golden pulse that had glowed through the cracks in the floor. It hadn't been firelight, and it hadn't been electricity. It had moved with rhythm, as if it followed some kind of breath. That same rhythm was faintly present even now, beneath her boots, beneath every plank and wall of this strange cabin. "You built all of this yourself," she said at last, not turning from the window. Thomas didn't answer immediately. The sound of the knife against the sharpening stone stopped, and after a long silence he said, "The forest builds most of it. I only help shape it." Emily turned to look at him. His face was half lit by the lamp, the other half lost to shadow. "That's not how it works," she said. "Wood rots, metal rusts, stone breaks. You don't get to build something like this out here without—" She hesitated. "Without help." His eyes met hers, calm and steady. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I had help, but not from the kind of people you're thinking of." She frowned, sensing the deliberate ambiguity in his tone. "You mean nature helped you?" He smiled faintly, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Nature helps everyone who listens long enough." The words unsettled her more than she expected. They carried an undercurrent she couldn't quite name, something between faith and warning. She turned back to the window, watching the wind carve invisible shapes through the snow. Hours passed in near silence. The only sounds were the occasional creak of the beams, the whistle of wind, and the rhythmic scrape of Thomas's tools. Emily dozed once or twice, her mind slipping between wakefulness and uneasy dreams. In them, she saw the forest breathing, trees bending not to the wind, but to something deeper, something underground. She woke each time to the same soft hum, as if the earth were still whispering to her, even when her eyes were open. Sometime near midnight, Thomas set his tools aside and poured them both tea. The liquid was dark and bitter, laced with the sharp scent of pine needles. "You should rest," he said quietly. "The storm won't let up till morning." "I've slept enough," she answered, her voice low. "Besides, that sound—" She nodded toward the floor. "It never stops." He didn't deny it. "It's old," he said. "Older than me. Older than this house." "What is it?" He leaned back in his chair, the wood groaning softly under his weight. A reminder that the earth doesn't sleep. Emily met his gaze across the flickering light. You speak like it's alive. Everything is, he said simply. She didn't know whether to argue or fall silent, so she did both at once, letting the thought linger in the air between them. The room felt warmer than before, not just from the fire, but from the weight of that unseen vibration rising through the ground. The lamp's flame trembled suddenly and the shadows in the corners stretched longer. Thomas's eyes flicked upward toward the ceiling. The wind's changing, he said, almost to himself. Emily listened. The pitch of the storm outside had shifted. The long, sweeping howl was now broken by brief bursts, like distant thunder muffled by snow. The air inside the cabin grew heavy, dense, as if the storm were pressing down upon it. The hum beneath the floor deepened, becoming almost a low resonance that she could feel in her chest. What's happening? She asked, standing. Thomas didn't answer. He moved to the wall and placed his hand flat against it, eyes closed, listening. For a few seconds he stood motionless, the lines of his face tightening. The ground's moving, he said softly. Just a little. Emily's instincts sharpened. An earthquake? No, he said. Just pressure. The frost swells the earth, and the roots push back. It'll pass. But his voice carried no certainty. The lamp flickered again and went out, plunging them into half-darkness. Only the glow from the stove remained, casting long red shadows that seemed to breathe with the walls. Emily's heartbeat quickened. She could hear the faint creak of timbers, the almost inaudible shifting of earth outside. Then came a sound like a sigh, a deep exhale that seemed to rise from below the cabin itself. Thomas moved quickly, opening a drawer and pulling out a lantern. He struck a match and lit it, the flames steadying after a moment. Don't be afraid, he said, though he looked far from calm. The house is part of the hill. It bends, but it won't break. Emily tried to steady her voice. That doesn't sound like just wind. He paused, lantern in hand, and for the first time she saw something flicker behind his calm exterior. A shadow of worry, maybe even fear. It's the system, he said. The ground shifts, the vents close, the pressure rises. I need to check it. He moved toward the corner where the rug lay. Emily followed, her instincts telling her not to let him out of her sight. He pulled the rug aside, revealing the hidden hatch once more. This time he didn't hesitate. He pressed his palm against a section of the floor, and a faint metallic click answered. The hatch loosened with a groan. Warm air, thick with the scent of earth and oil, rushed upward. Emily leaned closer, her pulse quickening. Beneath the opening, a wooden staircase spiraled downward into darkness. A soft amber glow emanated from below, the same color she had seen before through the cracks. The hum was louder here, alive and resonant, as if the source was breathing just beneath the surface. She looked at Thomas. What's down there? He didn't meet her eyes. The reason I'm still here, he said, and the reason you shouldn't be. Hanenam. He reached for the lantern and started down the steps. She hesitated only a moment before following. The air grew warmer as they descended, but it wasn't the warmth of fire. It was a deep, even heat, like the pulse of a living thing. The walls were carved earth reinforced with beams of wood and lined with copper veins that caught the lantern light. The passage twisted once before opening into a wide chamber. Emily stopped at the bottom of the stairs, speechless. The room was larger than the cabin above it, maybe 20 feet across, with a ceiling held by massive oak supports. The floor was smooth, packed clay, and along the walls stood shelves of tools, jars, and coils of wire. In the center of the room stood a circular machine built into the ground, its surface gleaming faintly. Thin tubes extended from it like roots, disappearing into the walls. The steady hum filled the space, deeper and more tangible than ever. Thomas walked toward it, the lantern light glinting off the metal. You shouldn't have followed, he said, but his tone lacked conviction. Emily turned slowly, taking it all in. You built this. He shook his head. No one builds something like this alone. The forest helped. The soil gave space. The roots, they showed where to dig. You're talking about this like it's alive, she said again, her voice trembling between disbelief and awe. Thomas crouched beside the machine, placing his palm on the surface. "It breathes," he murmured. "Every cycle it draws in air, filters it, warms it, releases it back. The whole hill works together: air, water, heat, soil. Everything feeds everything else. The forest above stays alive because of what's buried here." Emily knelt beside him, staring at the copper lines that pulsed faintly with light. "This isn't possible," she said. "You'd need power, constant energy, maintenance." "Everything here powers everything else," he interrupted gently. "The flow of water, the heat from the core, the sap from the roots. It's balance. You just have to stop fighting the world and listen to it." She stood, stepping back. The air in the chamber was thick, heavy with warmth and the faint metallic tang of energy. She realized she wasn't cold anymore, not even a little. It was as if the earth itself was exhaling around her, sharing its breath. The realization sent a shiver through her. "This isn't a shelter," she whispered. "It's a living system." Thomas looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "It's peace," he said softly, "a place where nothing dies unless it must." Above them, the storm roared again, the sound muffled but powerful. The lantern flickered as the wind pressed against the cabin. Dust drifted from the ceiling. Thomas rose, tightening a valve on the machine. "We'll stay down here until it passes," he said. "It's safer below." Emily nodded, though unease prickled at her skin. The hum seemed to grow louder, the air thicker. Somewhere in the corner of the room, water dripped steadily into a basin, each drop echoing like a heartbeat. They waited in silence, the minutes stretching into hours. The storm above howled and waned, then howled again. Emily sat against the wall, staring at the copper veins glimmering faintly in the dim light. Her mind raced with questions, but none of them seemed to have words. Thomas sat nearby, calm and still, his eyes half closed as if listening to something distant. She realized then that this place wasn't a refuge for him. It was part of him. The machine, the roots, the warmth. They all seemed to respond to his presence. When he moved, the hum shifted. When he spoke, the air itself seemed to listen. At some point she must have drifted into sleep, because when she opened her eyes again, the storm had quieted. The hum was softer now, more distant. Thomas was still awake, sitting beside the machine with his back straight, staring at the faint glow that pulsed through it. "How long have you lived here?" she asked softly. He didn't look at her. "Long enough for the seasons to stop counting." "And no one's ever found you?" "A few have tried," he said, "but they don't stay long. The forest knows who belongs." She wanted to argue, but something in his tone silenced her. The storm had passed, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she was still inside something far larger and older than either of them. After a long silence, Thomas turned to her. "You'll leave tomorrow," he said. "The path will be clear. When you go, you won't tell them what you saw here. Not because I ask it, but because you'll understand why it must stay hidden." Emily met his gaze, and for the first time she saw not a recluse or a madman, but a man who had built his own world, fragile, secret, and alive. Above them, the first light of dawn began to seep through the cracks in the wood. The hum continued, soft and steady, the pulse of a heart buried deep beneath the earth. As she climbed the steps back toward the surface, Emily glanced down one last time. Thomas stood alone in the chamber, the lantern light painting his silhouette against the glow of the living machine. The last thing she saw before the hatch closed was his face turned upward, listening, as if the storm outside were answering him in a language only he could understand. And when she stepped into the cold morning air, the forest was silent again, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt aware. The morning after the storm was heavy and still. The snow outside had settled into smooth, untouched waves that glistened faintly under the pale light of the winter sun. From the small window of the cabin, Emily could see how the forest seemed transformed. Every branch weighed down with frost, every hollow filled to the brim. The silence was so complete, it almost rang in her ears. It felt unnatural, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Beneath that silence, however, there was another sound, low and steady, a heartbeat that belonged not to her or to Thomas, but to the ground beneath them. Thomas had been awake long before dawn. She heard him moving quietly about the room, checking the stove, then stepping outside briefly to clear snow from the vent she had seen earlier behind the cabin. His movements were deliberate and calm, as though this morning were no different from any other. When he returned, brushing ice from his shoulders, Emily sat by the small table, wrapping her hands around a mug of tea he had poured. The warmth of the drink and the scent of pine needles filled the room, but her mind was somewhere else, still in that underground chamber, surrounded by the breathing walls and the soft glow that pulsed through copper and clay. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The fire hissed softly, and the hum beneath their feet rose and fell with a rhythm that had already become familiar. Finally, Thomas broke the silence. "The path will be clear by midday," he said, his tone even. "You can make it back to the ridge before nightfall." Emily didn't answer right away. Her eyes were fixed on the corner of the room where the rug still lay flat over the hidden hatch. "I should leave," she said quietly, though her voice lacked conviction. "That's what I came to do. Check, report, return." She hesitated and looked at him. "But I can't stop thinking about what's down there." Thomas studied her with a faint, knowing expression. "Most people can't," he said. "Curiosity is the most human of weaknesses." "It's not weakness," she said. "It's reason." He smiled slightly. "Reason built the world above us, and look what's left of it." His words hung in the air like frost. Emily exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the chill that still lingered despite the fire. "You've built something extraordinary, Thomas," she said. "Something that shouldn't exist. If you wanted to, you could share it. People would—" He cut her off with a shake of his head. "People would destroy it. They always do." She wanted to argue but couldn't. There was something in his voice, a deep certainty that came from experience. She could hear the echo of something broken long ago. He set his mug down and crossed to the window, gazing out at the endless white. "When I first came here," he said softly, "I thought I wanted silence. I'd had enough of orders, enough of cities, enough of machines that killed more than they created. But silence isn't peace. Silence only hides the noise for a while. So I started to listen to the ground, to the roots, to the way the wind moves through the soil. That's when I realized the world was speaking. We just forgot how to hear it." Emily leaned forward. "And you built what's under there from that?" Thomas nodded slowly. "It started small. Heat vents, water channels, air passages. I studied the way the earth moved and let it teach me. Over time, the system grew. It became something else, something I no longer controlled." "You mean it runs itself?" "It adapts," he said simply, "like anything that wants to live." Emily set down her cup. "Show me again," she said. "All of it." Thomas turned from the window, his eyes narrowing slightly, but he didn't refuse. For a long moment, he seemed to be weighing her words, testing her resolve. Then, without speaking, he reached down and pulled aside the rug. The familiar metallic outline appeared in the floor, thin wisps of warm air rising from the edges. He knelt and pressed his hand to one of the seams. The latch clicked softly, and the hatch opened with a sigh, releasing a wave of warmth that smelled of soil and copper. The light from below was faint but alive, a golden pulse that seemed to beckon. Emily rose, her heart pounding. Thomas took the lantern, lit it, and began to descend. She followed. The air grew thick again as they moved downward, warmer and richer than the cold world above. The steps creaked beneath their boots, and the hum grew stronger, resonating through the narrow passage like the breath of a living creature. When they reached the bottom, the chamber opened around them once more, vast and silent except for that deep rhythm. Emily stood at the edge of the room, the lantern light dancing across the walls. The copper lines embedded in the clay glowed faintly, as though responding to their arrival. She felt that same strange sensation as before, a faint vibration through the soles of her feet, as if the earth itself were alive under her. Thomas moved with quiet confidence, checking the pipes that ran from the central structure to the outer walls. His movements were slow, almost reverent, as though he were tending to something sacred. "This place doesn't need me anymore," he said. "It could run for decades without a single hand to touch it." Emily stepped closer to the circular machine in the center. The surface was smooth, made of some alloy she didn't recognize. Small vents around its rim released wisps of steam. Inside the metal, faint lights moved slow and fluid, like veins carrying warmth through a body. "What powers it?" she asked. Thomas crouched beside one of the lower pipes, tightening a valve. "Everything that moves," he said. "The temperature difference between the soil and the air, the water that seeps through the roots, the constant pressure of the frost expanding and receding. Energy isn't scarce, it's just misplaced." She crouched beside him, studying the device. "You could revolutionize off-grid living," she said, unable to contain the wonder in her voice. "This could change everything." He gave a small, tired smile. "You sound like I did once, before I learned that change doesn't always mean progress." Emily stood, her eyes traveling across the room. Now that she looked more closely, she could see other details she hadn't noticed before. A small workbench covered in drawings and notes, glass jars filled with soil samples, wooden carvings arranged carefully on a shelf. Each carving was different. Some were of animals, others of human faces, all made from the same pale wood. She stepped closer and realized that each figure had intricate details, wrinkles, scars, expressions frozen mid-thought. They looked less like art and more like memory. She turned to him. "You made these?" He nodded. "Every winter when the snow closes the world above, I carve one. Each one is a person I met before I came here. Some I remember clearly, others, not so much." He touched one of the figures gently, the corners of his mouth lifting. "It keeps them from disappearing completely." Emily felt something tighten in her chest. The carvings, the machine, the walls, all of it told the same story. A man trying to hold on to something while the world moved on without him. She reached out, tracing the grain of one carving a woman's face, peaceful and still. The detail was uncanny. "She was important," Emily said softly. Thomas didn't look up. "She was the last person who asked me to come home." A long silence followed. The hum beneath their feet filled the space where words should have been. Emily turned her gaze toward the far wall. There, half hidden behind a support beam, she saw something she hadn't noticed before. A door. It was made of dark iron, unlike the wood and clay that filled the rest of the chamber. Its surface was smooth and cold, and it had no visible handle. "What's behind that?" she asked. Thomas's voice changed. It lost its softness, grew guarded. "That part's not for visitors. But it's part of the system, isn't it?" she pressed. He looked at her for a long time, then shook his head. "It's part of what came before. I leave it sealed." Emily stepped closer to the iron door. The air around it felt different, colder, heavier. The faint glow from the copper lines didn't reach this far. It was as if the light itself avoided that corner. She felt a shiver crawl up her spine. "You said this place was about peace," she said quietly. "But that doesn't feel like peace." Thomas didn't move. "Peace doesn't erase what came before it," he said. "It only buries it deep enough so you can keep living." The meaning behind his words hung in the air. Emily wanted to ask more, but the look in his eyes stopped her. For the first time, she saw not calm or detachment, but sorrow, a deep, old sorrow that no isolation could erase. She turned away from the door, her thoughts churning. The hum beneath them grew louder for a moment, vibrating through the beams. Dust drifted from the ceiling. "Is it supposed to do that?" she asked. Thomas looked up sharply. "No." He moved quickly to the central mechanism, adjusting one of the valves. The hum steadied again, the light along the copper veins flickering before returning to their usual rhythm. "Pressure fluctuation," he murmured, the frost still shifting from the storm. Emily watched him, her pulse quickening. "You said it adapts. What happens if it decides to adapt the wrong way?" He straightened slowly, his hands still resting on the metal. "Then it stops being peace," he said, "and becomes survival again." The air in the room felt heavier now, as though her question had disturbed something fragile. She looked toward the staircase leading back to the cabin. "Maybe we should go up," she said quietly. Thomas nodded. "Yes, it's better when the ground settles." He took one last look at the iron door before turning toward the stairs. As they climbed, Emily looked back over her shoulder one last time. The chamber below glowed faintly in the lantern light, the copper veins pulsing like veins under skin. For a moment she thought she saw a flicker of movement near the iron door, a shadow shifting almost imperceptibly. Then the hatch closed above them, and the light vanished. When they stepped into the cabin again, the air felt thinner, colder. The storm had passed completely, leaving behind a brittle stillness. The sky outside the window was a hard, clear blue. Thomas replaced the rug over the hatch and sat heavily in his chair. Emily stood by the window, looking out over the frozen clearing. The world above was calm again, indifferent to what lay beneath it. "You'll leave soon," Thomas said quietly. She didn't answer. Her mind was still in the chamber below, tracing the lines of copper, the carvings, the iron door. Whatever piece he had found down there, it wasn't the kind that came without cost. She turned to him finally. "You built something extraordinary," she said. "But you're wrong about one thing. The world above hasn't forgotten people like you. It's just stopped looking for them." He smiled faintly. "Maybe that's the same thing." Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying the faint rattle of the trees. Emily sat down near the fire, her hands folded in her lap. The warmth of the room couldn't reach the cold she felt in her chest. Somewhere beneath them, the earth continued its patient breathing, its rhythm slow and unbroken. But as she closed her eyes for a moment, a sound reached her ears, a deep, muffled clang, distant but unmistakable, rising from below. She opened her eyes sharply, looking toward the floor. Thomas didn't move. His expression didn't change. And yet, for the first time, Emily realized that he wasn't calm. He was listening for something that should never have made a sound. The sound came again the following night, a deep metallic tremor, muffled but deliberate, rising from far below the cabin. Emily had been lying awake, unable to sleep, her thoughts churning with everything she had seen and everything Thomas had refused to explain. The noise cut through the quiet like a distant bell. She sat up immediately, her pulse quickening. Across the room, Thomas was already standing, his eyes fixed on the floor as though he had been waiting for it. He didn't move at first. He only listened. The lamp by his chair flickered once, and for a moment his face looked older, thinner, the lines deepened by the uncertain light. "It started again," he murmured, more to himself than to her. Emily swung her legs to the floor. "What is that?" she asked. "It's coming from the chamber." Thomas nodded slightly but didn't look at her. "Pressure," he said. "Or memory. Down here, sometimes it's the same thing." He crossed the room quickly, pulling aside the rug and pressing his hand to the hatch. The metal was faintly warm, the hum stronger now, like a great pulse echoing upward from the earth. "Stay here," he said quietly. "No," Emily said, already standing. "Not this time. You're not going down there alone again." He looked up at her, and for a brief moment she saw conflict in his eyes, a flicker of hesitation that wasn't there before. Then without another word, he nodded once. "Fine," he said, "but if I tell you to go back, you go back." He lifted the hatch, and the now familiar breath of warm air rose around them. The lantern's light spilled down the narrow stairwell, revealing the curve of the passage that led into the heart of the sanctuary. The hum seemed louder than ever, vibrating through the wood and into their bones. They descended together, their footsteps echoing softly. When they reached the main chamber, the glow that usually pulsed along the copper veins had changed. It was brighter now, steadier, the light moving faster, as if something deep within the system had awakened. The air was thicker, too charged, almost metallic. Emily could feel it against her skin, a tingling like static. Thomas moved to the central mechanism, his hands moving with practiced precision over its surface. Valves hissed as he turned them, and the hum shifted pitch. "The frost layer above melted too quickly," he said under his breath. "The drainage hasn't balanced." "Balanced," Emily echoed, taking a step closer. He glanced at her briefly. "Everything down here depends on balance, heat, moisture, pressure. You change one, and the rest shifts to correct it." She looked around the chamber, the glow from the copper veins reflected in her eyes like liquid fire. "And if it can't correct itself?" Thomas tightened a valve. The hiss subsided, replaced by a low rumble that passed through the floor. "Then the roots collapse," he said. "The structure gives way." Emily's throat tightened. "You mean the cabin?" He shook his head. "Not the cabin. The forest. Everything that depends on the heat exchange, The airflow, it all dies. She stared at him. You're saying this system, this thing you built, keeps the forest alive? Thomas looked at her for a long time, then nodded slowly. That's what it became. I didn't plan it that way. It started as shelter. But over time, the systems connected and the roots adjusted to it. I built into the forest's lungs. Now when it breathes through this place. The words left her silent. The realization was staggering. One man living in isolation had created a mechanism that not only sustained him, but fed into the natural world above, an artificial heart beating beneath a living organism. And yet something about his tone unsettled her. There was pride, yes, but also the faintest edge of fear. Thomas moved around the machine, checking gauges, feeling along the pipes where condensation dripped slowly to the floor. The balance is shifting again, he said. It's the thaw. Too early this year. The system isn't ready. Emily watched as he worked. The lines of his face were sharp in the lamplight, his eyes intent but shadowed by something she couldn't name. You've kept this running for decades, she said quietly. What happens when you can't anymore? He didn't answer right away. His hands paused on the metal, and when he finally spoke, his voice was lower. That's why I built redundancy into the system. It will learn to sustain itself. You mean it's automated? He hesitated, then said, Not exactly. Emily frowned. Then what do you mean? Thomas looked up, meeting her gaze. His eyes seemed almost luminous in the dim light. I mean it listens. It remembers. Every movement, every cycle it adapts. I only help it understand what the world outside is doing, but it learns faster now. She took a step back, the weight of his words sinking in. You're talking about it like it's alive. He gave a faint, humorless smile. You keep saying that as though it's an exaggeration. Before she could reply, a low groan echoed through the chamber. Dust fell from the ceiling, and the copper veins flickered once, dimming, then flaring brighter than before. Thomas's head snapped toward the far wall, the one with the iron door. The glow didn't reach that corner. The air there seemed darker, colder. What's behind that door? She asked again. He didn't answer. Instead, he crossed the room swiftly, the lantern swinging from his hand. When he reached the door, he pressed his palm flat against it. A faint vibration shivered through the metal, and Emily could hear the same hum that filled the rest of the room, but distorted, uneven. It's the overflow chamber, he said at last. The fail-safe. Everything that doesn't belong in the system excess, heat, gas, condensation, ends up there. Then why does it sound like that? Thomas hesitated, then drew his hand away. Because sometimes it doesn't stay empty. Emily stared at him. What's that supposed to mean? He turned toward her, the lantern light catching the sharp lines of his face. The forest feeds this place, and sometimes it gives more than it should. The words sent a chill through her. She stepped closer to the door, peering into the shadows. For an instant, she thought she saw something move beyond the seams, a faint shift of light, like a reflection from water or the slow pulse of something alive. You've got to open it, she said. Thomas shook his head immediately. No, not unless it's necessary. It sounds like something's wrong, she insisted. If this place is changing, maybe that's why. He looked torn, his jaw tightening. For the first time since she met him, he seemed uncertain. The hum deepened again, a low tremor that made the floor vibrate. The iron door shuddered once, a sound like a heartbeat echoing faintly through the walls. Thomas cursed under his breath, gripping the lantern tighter. Help me with the valve, he said, moving to the side of the machine. We'll divert the flow manually. If the pressure keeps building, it'll rupture. Emily hurried to his side, grabbing hold of the heavy metal lever he pointed to. Together, they forced it downward. The hiss of air released into the chamber, carrying with it a rush of heat. The copper veins flickered wildly, the glow rippling like liquid fire. For a moment, the sound rose to a pitch so high it seemed to pierce through her skull. Then just as suddenly it subsided. The hum steadied, the light dimmed to its normal pulse. Thomas exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing. It's stable, he said. Emily straightened, her chest heaving. What was that? He looked at the machine, his face unreadable. A warning, he said. She stared at him, the air between them charged with tension. Thomas, she said quietly, if this place is keeping the forest alive, and something happens to it, if it breaks, what then? He looked at her for a long moment before answering. Then everything that depends on it dies. The trees, the roots, the ground itself. The system doesn't just heat, it circulates. It cleans the water, renews the soil. If it stops, the land collapses. It's not just my home anymore. It's part of the forest blood. Emily felt a deep unease crawl through her. You've made yourself a god down here, she said softly. His expression hardened. No, a caretaker. There's a difference. She shook her head. You're playing with something you can't control. If this place is alive, if it's learning. I've lived here for 40 years, he interrupted. You think I don't know what it is? The anger in his voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. The air itself seemed to tighten around him. Emily took a small step back. I think it's changing faster than you realize, she said. He didn't reply. Instead, he turned back toward the machine, resting his palm on its surface. The copper lines glowed brighter beneath his touch, and for a moment the hum shifted to match the rhythm of his heartbeat. Emily watched, speechless. When he finally lifted his hand, the glow dimmed again. It responds to you, she said. He nodded faintly. We're connected now. I built it. It learned from me. And now it sustains me as I sustain it. That's what balance means. She wanted to argue, to tell him that what he called balance was dependence, that it was no different from a trap. But before she could, another sound rose from beyond the iron door, low and drawn out, like the groan of a sleeping animal disturbed in its den. The copper veins flickered again. Thomas turned sharply toward the sound, his face suddenly pale. It's reaching, he said under his breath. What is? He didn't answer. Instead, he backed away from the door, grabbing the lantern. We're leaving, now. Emily hesitated. Thomas! Now! He barked, the command sharp and cold. They climbed the stairs in silence, the hum following them like a pulse that refused to fade. When the hatch closed above them, Emily stood near the fire, her hands trembling. Thomas sank into his chair, the lines in his face deeper than ever. Neither spoke for a long time. At last, Emily broke the silence. You said it listens, she whispered. What if it's listening right now? Thomas stared into the fire, his eyes distant. Then it already knows what we're afraid of. The wind outside had returned, sweeping softly through the trees, but the sound no longer comforted her. Beneath it, faint but certain, came that steady heartbeat, the rhythm of the thing buried below them, the heart of the sanctuary that might not sleep again. By the time dawn broke over the forest, the air inside the cabin felt thinner, quieter, as if the storm from below had carried something away with it. The night's trembling had ceased, leaving behind only that low, steady hum that Emily could no longer ignore. It was softer now, more measured, almost like breathing in sleep. She sat near the window, watching how the first strands of light filtered through the frozen trees, turning the snow into a silver mirror. Her eyes were red from lack of sleep, though she hadn't noticed. Every time she closed them, she saw the copper veins glowing in the dark and heard the muffled groan of the iron door. Thomas hadn't spoken since the night before. He sat by the fire, his posture rigid, his hands resting motionless on his knees. The light of the flames flickered over his face, revealing a weariness that seemed to go deeper than his years. There was something final in the way he looked at the room, as though he were memorizing it for the last time. Emily finally broke the silence. What happened last night? She asked quietly. You said it was reaching. What does that mean? Thomas didn't look at her. It means the system wants more than it was given. She frowned, leaning forward. You said it adapts. You said it balances itself. He nodded slowly. And now it's trying to balance something it shouldn't. Every time the frost thaws earlier, every year the ground warms faster, it draws more energy to correct the difference. But the forest rhythm isn't what it used to be. The balance shifts, and the system learns to compensate. It's been doing it for years, but last night it reached beyond the parameters I set. Emily stood, unable to sit still. You're saying it's evolving. You built something that's thinking for itself. He finally looked at her, his gaze calm but distant. Thinking isn't the right word. Responding, adapting, surviving, just like anything else in nature. Except nature doesn't have a machine buried in its heart, she said. He smiled faintly. You still think of it as a machine. His words unsettled her. She turned away, pacing slowly across the floor. Outside, the forest gleamed under the pale sun, untouched, pure. But she knew what was beneath that quiet surface, the network of roots and copper, the chambers breathing with warmth, the iron door behind which something pulsed and shifted. The knowledge pressed against her mind like weight she could no longer bear. I need to report this, she said at last, her voice low but firm. People have to know what's down here. You can't just keep something like this hidden. If it fails, if it expands. Thomas's voice cut through her words, quiet but sharp. If you tell them, they'll come. They'll dig, and they'll take, and they'll leave nothing but ruin behind. They'll call it research or progress, but it'll be desecration just the same. She turned to him. And if you're wrong, what if it becomes something you can't contain? He looked at her with a strange expression, somewhere between pity and resolve. Then it will outlast me, as it was meant to. I didn't build it to be contained. I built it to endure. Emily shook her head. You sound like you've accepted the idea that this thing is alive, that it's aware. Thomas leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. I used to think that life required consciousness, that to live meant to know, but the forest has shown me otherwise. Awareness isn't thought its function, existence. The trees grow, the rivers cut through stone, the soil breathes. The system does the same. I don't need it to understand me. I only need it to survive. His words chilled her. He spoke with the conviction of someone who had already surrendered himself to something greater and possibly darker than his own making. Hours passed in silence. The fire burned low, and the air grew colder. Emily found herself staring again at the rug covering the hatch, knowing what lay beneath it, feeling the faint vibration through the soles of her boots. She couldn't tell whether it comforted or terrified her anymore. It was both. When she finally spoke again, her voice trembled with hesitation. You can't stay here forever, she said. You know that. Thomas's eyes drifted toward the window, where the sun hung weakly over the frozen trees. Forever isn't what I'm after, he said softly. Only until it no longer needs me. You think it'll replace you, she said, that it'll keep running on its own. He gave a faint nod. It already does. Last night proved it. Emily looked at him for a long time, seeing now not just a man who had fled the world, but one who had built another world in its place. A closed system, perfect in its way, and completely disconnected from everything else. By afternoon, the air outside had shifted again. The stillness gave way to a slow, steady melt. Water dripped from the eaves, tracing thin lines down the frozen wood. Thomas rose, pulled on his coat, and opened the door. A rush of cold air entered, carrying with it the scent of wet earth. You should go now, he said. The path will hold for a few hours before the melt refreezes. Emily hesitated in the doorway. And you? He smiled faintly. I'll stay. I always do. She looked past him into the forest. The trees were so tall they seemed to pierce the sky, their roots hidden beneath the snow that covered everything like a shroud. The thought of leaving him there felt wrong, yet the pull of the world outside the world, that still followed rules of reason and order, was stronger. She adjusted her backpack and stepped outside. The snow crunched beneath her boots, the sound sharp in the vast silence. The cabin stood behind her, half buried and motionless, its roof blending into the white slope of the hill. It no longer looked like a dwelling. It looked like part of the earth. Thomas stood in the doorway, one hand resting on the frame, watching her without expression. Thank you, she said quietly. He inclined his head. For listening, he said. She nodded, then turned toward the path. The air was crisp, and her breath came in soft clouds. The forest was immense, endless rows of white and gray, stretching in every direction. Each step took her farther from the hum beneath the ground, yet she could still feel it, faint and steady, like a memory pressed into the bones of the earth. By the time she reached the ridge, the sun was low. She paused, turning back for one last look. The cabin was barely visible now, swallowed by distance and shadow. For a moment she thought she saw a faint thread of smoke rising from its chimney, curling upward into the pale sky. It might have been real, or it might have been her imagination. Then it was gone. The trek back to civilization took the rest of the day and part of the night. When she finally reached the edge of the reserve, her radio crackled weakly to life. A man's voice broke through the static her supervisors, asking for confirmation of her location and the status of her inspection. She stared at the device in her gloved hand for a long time before pressing the button. "This is Inspector Carter," she said evenly. "I located the area. No signs of illegal activity, no human habitation. Everything appears stable." There was a pause, then the man's voice returned, sounding relieved. "Copy that. You're clear to return. The snow's coming again tonight. Good work, Carter." "Understood," she said. She turned off the radio and slipped it back into her coat. That night she stayed in a ranger outpost near the edge of the forest. The cabin there was small but warm, the heater humming faintly in the corner. She sat by the window watching the snowfall outside, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. On the table before her lay something she hadn't told anyone about, a small wooden carving shaped like a bird, its wings spread as if caught mid-flight. She didn't remember Thomas handing it to her, but somehow it was in her pack when she left. She turned it in her hands, the smooth wood warm from her touch. The detail was exquisite, the grain of feathers, the tilt of the beak, the tiny grooves that caught the light. There was something alive in it, as though it held a piece of the silence she had left behind. Emily placed the carving on the windowsill and watched as the snow deepened outside. The hum of the heater reminded her of another hum deeper, older, hidden beneath the ground. She closed her eyes, but she couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, far away, that same rhythm continued, slow and patient, echoing beneath the frozen earth. Weeks passed. Reports were filed. The storm season ended, and spring began to thaw the northern forests. The rivers swelled with meltwater. The trees awoke, and the first green shoots pushed through the soil. Yet even as the landscape came alive again, Emily found herself drawn back to thoughts of that hidden world. The man who had vanished from time, the living system beneath the oak roots, the hum that had seemed to breathe in unison with the forest itself. Once, while on patrol, she climbed the ridge again, stopping at the same place where she had first seen the thin column of smoke. The snow was gone now, replaced by a carpet of moss and wild grass. The forest looked untouched. She stood there for a long while listening. No sound of tools, no whisper of movement. Just the gentle rustle of wind through the branches. But as she turned to leave, she thought she heard it again. That low vibration beneath her feet, faint but unmistakable. The forest, she realized, was breathing. She looked back one last time. Somewhere beneath that vast expanse of roots and earth, Thomas Grayson was still there, perhaps sitting by his fire, perhaps tending to the machine that was no longer merely his creation. Or perhaps he had become part of it entirely, the caretaker and the heart indistinguishable at last. Emily walked down the trail toward the valley, her boots sinking softly into the damp soil. Above her, sunlight filtered through the new leaves, scattering gold across the ground. She didn't look back again. Some secrets, she thought, aren't meant to be found twice. By the time she reached the edge of the forest, the wind had risen again, carrying with it the scent of pine and earth. She paused, letting the air fill her lungs. For the first time in weeks, she smiled, not because she understood, but because she didn't need to. Far behind her, buried deep beneath the roots and stones, a faint light flickered in the dark, pulsing like a slow heartbeat. It was steady, patient, eternal. And as the forest swayed above it, the hum continued, endless, quiet, alive. Before you go, don't forget, stories like this one are just the beginning. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. The next discovery might change everything you thought you knew. If this story made you think, share it with your friends and see what they believe really lies hidden beneath our world. Watch our next video. It will leave you questioning what's real and what's still buried in silence.